Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yes. So I'm going to continue with my series of talks on the practice of insight from the point of view of Chinese Buddhism, particularly the teachings specifically related to having insight into our true nature, into the nature of experience, and to be able to transcend suffering through being able to perceive the empty nature of the self. The aggregates, what makes up the self, which we call the five aggregates or the five skandhas: form, feeling, perception, conception, which is one, and then our mental formations, our habit energy, and the fifth one being our consciousness. So in this particular series of teachings, I was hoping to do part 3 and part 4 and part 5 today. But part 3 is quite extensive, and I just want to touch and do a good job with part 3 if possible, and then leave part 4 and part 5 for another time, because we're going to go into a different set of teachings starting next week, which relates actually to part 5. So one of the texts that I'm referring to, but just tangentially, is this text called the Sutra on Concentration on Sitting Meditation. So this was translated by Kumra Jiva in 401, as I had mentioned before, and contains 5 practices for sitting meditation. And our teacher, Xiankuan, has been talking about the later development of this in the 6-gate practice of Tiantai Buddhism, but I'm giving a more foundational talk about this practice before it was transformed. I'm also actually relying a little bit more on a section of a teaching called the 5 Approaches to Meditation, which was also translated by Kumra Jiva at around the same time. This is called the 5 Stabilization Mind Contemplations that have to do with insight practice. And for the first 3 of the 5, they're identical. They are different in steps 4 and 5, but for our purposes, we can maintain an understanding that these 2 treatments of the same subject are very closely interconnected. So what are the 5 in the Zhoushan Sanmei Jing, the Sutra on Concentration and Sitting Meditation? This is insight into impurities, which have to do with the curing of lust and craving. Insight into friendliness, which would be loving kindness and compassion, which is the method of curing anger. And our topic today, which is the insight into conditions, which is the method of curing ignorance. And then the others that are a little bit different: insight into inhalation and exhalation, which is the method of curing discursive thoughts, which is part 5 in the Wuting Xiankuan, and insight into single-minded concentration on the Buddha, which is the method of curing equally those with multiple problems, which is somewhat different than what's contained in the other teaching. So here in the Wuting Xiankuan, to review, the first level is actually called Bujingguan, but I made a case for it actually being bugobujing, which means neither impure nor pure in an earlier talk. Last time talking about loving kindness and compassion, which is a very important practice that I outlined last time, Zibiguan. And then we have causes and condition insight, which is what I am wanting to discuss in more detail today, Xiankuan, and then the worldly discrimination, which I believe is related more to the 5 aggregates, insight, and then the mindful breathing, which was in step number 4 of the previous text mentioned. So today we're going to talk about causes and conditions. So what is meant by causes and conditions? Well, this has to do with dependent co-arising, and we should be reminded that in the Buddha's awakening, when the Buddha was having his great enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, he went through 3 watches of the night. In the first watch, he had certain revelations about his past life and reflections on certain aspects of his own development. In the second watch, he had the realization of the 4 Noble Truths. And in the third watch of the night, he had the realization of dependent co-arising. And when he had that realization, he went back and forth between, this is again, maybe before I go into that, just mentioning the 4 Noble Truths. The first Noble Truth is the truth that there is suffering in the world, suffering in the mind. And there is a cause for this suffering. And for our purposes, we can say that that cause is craving that's rooted in the 12 links of dependent co-arising, and has as its root ignorance, namely that we do things in hoping that those things that we do are going to bring us happiness, but in fact have the opposite effect, because we don't have good knowledge, good awareness, good wisdom, not enough insight to help us to see that. And then we have the 3rd Noble Truth, which is the cessation of suffering. There is a way to stop suffering. And this path leading to the cessation of suffering is the 4th Noble Truth, the Eightfold Path, which starts with right view. So right view of the cause of suffering is actually the in-depth understanding of dependent co-arising. So when the Buddha had this great awareness, he then reviewed in his meditation the forward and backward process of how suffering comes to be. And this great awareness called the 12 links, the 12 causes, nidana, the causes. This is part of the Buddhist teachings that he refers to quite a bit. So this is actually a chart, may be difficult to read because it's rather small, but it goes into the subcategories and the Pali and the Chinese. There's quite a bit here, but what we're interested in is craving, and craving is the craving for sense-based pleasures, the craving for existence, and even the craving for non-existence. At a certain point in life, we think, oh no, I don't want this existence. So this is another type of craving. So it is the eradication of cravings means the eradication of this kind of craving. But in another teaching that I'm going to go into, the Mahanidana Sutta, he goes into even more depth. This is another way of being able to perceive the 12 links. lots of pictures of the 12 links. Here's another picture of the 12 links, and we can see how the link number 8 is the link of craving. Yes. So rather than to go into a lot of detail about the 12 links, I just want to stay with craving from the point of view of the Mahanidana Sutta, called the Great Causes Discourse. So most people discover the path to stop suffering when they realize that the cause of their suffering is based on craving and clinging. I'm wanting this, and I'm going for it, I'm grabbing onto it, and now it's causing me great pain. So it's good to explore this craving in more detail, and in the Mahanidana Sutta, that's what the Buddha does. Here it is in the English, the section that I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to go into this in specifically reading the text for those people who are very good at... okay. So if you're versed in Pali, you can get it this way. And if you're versed in Chinese, I decided to put it up there. Hopefully this is the right section. So the Mahanidana Sutta goes into this depth. So he talks about, in this sutta, he goes into great depth about two of the links, craving and consciousness. So this is the section that we're looking at here in the Mahanidana Sutta, which it breaks down craving into a sequence of 10 steps. Now 10 is a lot to remember, so I have here shortened it to 3 steps. And you can break down the steps in between the 3 steps if you like. But first, there's a feeling, and this then leads to a sense of craving, of wanting, and then that leads to increasing wanting, which is kind of greediness, and then eventually this leads to some form of conflict. Okay. So, let me go to, the feeling conditions craving, and then greediness and lustfulness, desire conditions are bent on wanting more, and then because of the guarding of possessions, there arises this conflict. So I want to come to this craving table. I want to talk about external craving first. So here are the 10 steps. First, a person has a feeling about something. Oh, I want this. I feel hungry for ice cream. And then the next step is called seeking. I need to look and see where Ted Drew's is located. And then I want to do acquiring. I want to find the way to get to Ted Drew's. Do you know how to get there from here? Okay. So then decision making. When I get there, I decide what flavor I want. And then the greediness comes in. How big of a size can I get? I don't really want the kiddie size. Even the small, maybe the regular, or maybe a really big one. Yes. And then no matter how much I eat, I still want more. I don't want anybody else to have a bite. It's mine, and my flavor is the best. That's why you want it. Get away from me. Don't try to take any from my cup, and if you try to touch my ice cream, I'm going to hit you. This is the sequence of the craving table for external things. But also there's internal kind of craving. This may be like a person who is insecure about their abilities. So they Their feeling of insecurity gives rise to the craving of wanting to have good ability, but it's not really well-founded on being of benefit to others. It's founded on their own ego. So they're unable to ask for feedback. They have a negative imagining of what others are thinking about them, what they're saying about them. And then this leads them to more self-doubt. And then they will withdraw, they'll clam up, and they should say, I should know that I'm really good without asking for any feedback, without getting any feedback. I'm greedy about my own ability. And then it leads to, I have to be number one person in this area. I don't want anyone to, see if I can help this. I don't want anyone to see my weaknesses. I have to conceal my vulnerabilities, and my weaknesses get blown up really big, and I'm not going to let anybody close to me. So this is the sequence that takes place. So this is craving. All right. So what gives rise to craving? When we penetrate deeply, when we really meditate on this and we penetrate deeply and we go into craving, we say, what is causing this? Well, the underlying sense of this is feeling or sensation. Now, from the Buddhist point of view, sensation and feeling are very closely aligned, and it's connected to the body. In the West, we talk about feeling oftentimes from the point of view of emotion. From the Buddhist point of view, emotion is kind of like a combination of feeling and thinking. But we're not going to worry too much about that. We're going to look at both aspects. So a feeling, first, we need to be able to check and see what's going on with our feelings. What's happening? Is the feeling a wholesome feeling or is it unwholesome? This is very important. When we have wholesome feelings, we have this feeling within us, I want to be helpful and generous and honest and calm. And the opposite of that, unwholesome feelings, harmful, greedy, deceptive, distraught. Say, no one wants to be distraught, but if you watch lots of television, you'll see. We actually turn on the stations that have to do with drama. All these people are, lots of crime drama on television. Entire stations are focused on Special Victims Unit and Law and Order and things like that. One show after the other. This does not lend itself to calming the mind. The wholesome feelings of loving kindness and compassion, altruistic joy, equanimity are things that we would want to cultivate. We don't want to cultivate ill will and anger and hatred and cruelty, jealousy, envy, and extreme reactions. Another way of understanding feeling is that it comes either as an external, on the outside of our body, or internal, inside of our body. We usually associate with some kind of an emotion, but both feelings are very relevant in terms of checking to see what's going on. And the feeling comes in these three flavors: pleasant, unpleasant, and neither pleasant nor unpleasant. Now, I want to make a little bit of a distinction here because sometimes people think that neither pleasant nor unpleasant means neutral. If it meant neutral, the Buddha would have said pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. He didn't say that. He said neither pleasant nor unpleasant. So we need to contemplate this a little bit more to understand what this means and to be able to see it in the world, see it within ourselves, that neither pleasant nor unpleasant has a lot to do with ignorance, not knowing. We can't tell. And as a result, we numb out. We become sleepy. We lose our mindfulness. Not exactly the same as neutral. Also, feeling is related to the four elements. The earth, which is the solidity of the body, the water, which is the fluids in our body, the fire, which is the heat energy with the warmth within our body, and the air, our breath. And if you want to understand the feeling in the four elements, we're going to ask a master to give more of a talk on this, because master has a very good explanation of feeling in the four elements. There's also a teaching called the 8 bodily feelings, where there are 8 types of feeling that we have in the body: attraction, pressure, temperature, texture, spaciousness, location, frequency, and memory. And each one has its 2 sides, like pain and pleasure, heavy and light, hot and cold, etc. So that's another way of understanding our bodily feelings. From the point of view of emotions, there is the research of Paul Ekman. Actually, Paul Ekman, very involved in the field of emotional intelligence, also does quite a bit of research now with mindfulness. And I'm not going to go into Paul Ekman's work, but just to relate that there are these 6 major emotions, and he did a lot of work on this with faces. And if you want to learn, if you really want to have a direct experience with Paul Ekman's work, I recommend the movie Inside Out. Excellent movie about 5 of the 6 emotions in the body. And feeling can be rated in terms of intensity. We can say emotions are strong or weak, depending on how much we feel them. And there are, in psychotherapy, what are called emotion tables that have been developed that have different words attached to the different emotions. And you can rate how strong they are. Another aspect of feelings, which is very important and sometimes not directly paid attention to but this is one of the most important aspects of our understanding our feelings, is our feeling something that we attach to, or are we not attached to it? And this directly relates to the dart of painful feelings, which I'm quoting here. If the uninstructed worldling feels a pleasant feeling, he feels it attached. If he feels a painful feeling, he feels it attached. If he feels neither a painful nor pleasant feeling, he feels it attached. This, monks, is called the uninstructed worldling who is attached to birth, aging, and death, who is attached to sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair, who is attached to suffering, I say. And then later in the sutta, he says, if the noble disciple feels a pleasant feeling, he feels it not attached. If he feels a painful feeling, he feels it not attached. If he feels neither a painful nor a pleasant feeling, he feels it not attached. This, monks, is called the noble disciple who is not attached to birth, aging, and death, who is not attached to sorrow, lamentation, pain, dejection, and despair, who is not attached to suffering, I say. The final verse of the sutta. This, monks, is the distinction, the disparity, the difference between the instructed noble disciple and the uninstructed worldling. So that whether or not the person feels this feeling attached or not, the Buddha never says, don't feel a feeling. He says, feel the feeling, but know it as a bodily feeling instead of creating it more and more in the mind and making it a mental feeling that we attach to. So this is kind of a summary chart of feelings, checking to see whether they're wholesome or unwholesome, internal or external, pleasant or unpleasant, or neither. attached or not attached, and then from the Mahayana view, the awareness of whether this feeling is about ourselves or if it's to be of benefit to others. So, the bodily feeling, wholesome and unwholesome. The wholesome, we recognize, we experience our birth, our life stages. We know we enter eventually aging, sickness, and death. But if we try to cheat this in some way, we get involved oftentimes maybe in addictions or self-harm. We may know a feeling as to whether or not it's internal or external. If I have a problem with alcohol and I drive by a bar, suddenly I have a strong desire to drink. This is an external environmental trigger. But if I'm sitting in my house not doing anything and suddenly this urge comes, it may be a more internal. Am I able to let it go, or is it something that I can't let go of? And how much judging do I do of myself and others? When I see myself having this problem, is it something that I condemn myself for or condemn others for having? Or am I able to be in a more non-judgmental state and have compassion? Is my happiness related to my ego gratification for sense-based desire, or do I derive my happiness from being able to help others? Do I get caught up in existence versus non-existence? In each moment we have, am I accepting this moment as it is, or do I want this moment not to exist and have some other moment there? Do I fear pain and loss? Do I feel a lot of opposition to others? Yes. Do I get caught up in getting what I want or the loss of what I have? Or feeling a lot of uncertainty about things? Getting upset about getting what I don't want? Unexpected gains and losses will occur. Do I feel that it's a sense of contamination when these events take place, or when I are confronted by something that is unpleasant? And so on. The wholesomeness or versus selflessness and selfness. Ill will and resentment and guilt, avoidance, blame, self-blame, shock. My ego is being attacked, envy, jealousy, and rejection. And the wholesome antidotes to this in selflessness of the development of loving kindness and compassion, courage and equanimity, patience, altruistic joy, and acceptance and interconnectedness. These are the things that the practitioner will look at when they try to understand feelings. So when we practice craving and feeling insight, we examine what it is that's really going on within ourselves. And we try to purify ourselves so that we don't attach to these kinds of things. We notice them, we observe our craving, we observe our feelings, but we don't attach to it. We say, oh, I observe it, I accept that that's where I am, I can let that go. I don't have to get stuck there. So this is the release of our distress when we don't have to get stuck there. If you fight with this part of yourself, if you say, oh, I'm not supposed to feel this way, I'm not supposed to think this way, I'm not supposed to be this way, then you just end up in more conflict, more of a struggle, wrestling, very hard to win that. So simply observing, accepting, letting go, much easier practice. So just a word about step 4 in 2 minutes. Step 4 really has to do with being able to see into the true nature of the 5 skandhas. So the word Guan, insight, is also associated with the great Bodhisattva Guan Yin. And in this particular practice, there's this direct relationship between understanding the practice of Guan Yin, deep compassion, and insight into the 4th step and beyond. So, when we chant the Heart Sutra, for example, which we're going to do in a few moments, you'll see at the very beginning of the Heart Sutra the reference to the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, which is Guan Yin, deeply immersed in Prajna Paramita, which is the perfection of wisdom, the great insight and understanding. Clearly perceive the empty nature of the 5 skandhas. This is the 5 aggregates. So being able to perceive the empty nature of that, that's the 4th step. Transcending all suffering. So the 4th step prepares us to be able to see clearly into the empty nature. When we are able to see clearly into the empty nature, then the 3rd stage of insight, we can go more deeply than feelings. We can go into contact, the sense bases, and eventually we can penetrate all the way into what's called the hidden vortex of Namarupa, which is name and form, and finally into consciousness. That's a talk for another time. Give me another 10 years, I may have some understanding, a little bit better. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all beings never be separated from the altruistic joy, which is free from suffering. And may all beings dwell in the great equanimity, which is free from attachment, aversion, and ignorance.